We have three experts on internet governance with us today, and we're going to observe a conversation between them as they dialogue between each other. Through their discussion, we'll gain insight in how the internet is run, who runs it, and what terms the internet governance really means. On the panel, we have Byron Holland. Byron is the President and Chief Executive Officer at CIRA, and our host here today. Driven by an entrepreneurial spirit and a passion for internet governance, Byron's leadership has brought CIRA to the forefront of innovation. He led a wholesale redesign of the .ca registry and related policies and business rules. Byron has developed a strong international profile for CIRA and the .ca top-level domain. He is vice chair of the Country Codes Naming Supporting Organization, the body that represents the interests of all country code top-level domains and leads policy development initiatives at ICANN. Byron is also an active participant in the United Nations Coordinated Internet Governance Forum and other internet governance fora. Byron maintains a world-recognized blog, public domain. He can also be found on Twitter at CIRA001. We also have with us today Bill Graham, who's joining us. And Bill is a consultant on international internet policy based right here in Ottawa. He was appointed by the ICANN Board of Directors by the Generic Name Supporting Organization in 2011. Bill worked with the Internet Society, or ISOC, from 2007 to 2011 before joining ISOC as the Director of International Telecommunications Policy at Industry Canada, where he was responsible for Canadian participation in multilateral organizations. Finally, we are fortunate to have Bertrand also join the panel. So with that, I pass it over to Byron, and we'll have a great conversation on governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christopher. And on behalf of CIRA, I just also want to say welcome. Thank you all for participating in this forum. Obviously, without you, we can't have a forum, so thank you for showing up today. I'm really honored to be on the stage today with two people who are absolutely critical and central actors to how the internet is governed and administered. Both, as you've heard, are directors of the board of ICANN, and both have been in and around the governance and administration of the internet, dare I say it, since it began, in a sense. At least certainly since the incarnation of ICANN, and have seen it from many different views. We're very fortunate with Bill. He's seen it from a Canadian government perspective, also from the ISOC perspective, which is another one of those critical bodies in and around the internet ecosystem, and certainly now from inside the tent on the ICANN board. So I'm very pleased to have both of them here. Bill's a hometown individual, so we're also fortunate to have a local who can give us a local perspective on internet governance, both domestically and internationally. We've shared more than one or two coffees at various conferences around the world, maybe even a beer or two along the way, and had a lot of really good conversations about internet governance, where it's headed, what are the issues. And I've also been privileged to do the same with Bertrand over the various ICANN meetings. So the idea here was really to just have a conversation of which we want to bring all of the audience in a little bit, and talk about a few key questions. One of the things that always happens to me when people ask what I do and I try to explain what it is, I typically get the blank stare, or really somebody governs the internet, or I thought the government did that, which in a sense none of those are actually accurate. So I thought we'd talk about how the internet is actually governed and coordinated with two of the deepest experts on the subject, and really frame it around a few different questions. One is really, could we ask, because I get asked all the time, well, who runs the internet in Canada? Who runs the internet globally? And it's a question I get over and over and over again. And I think we'll chat a little bit about that. And the other one is, what does internet governance actually mean? The term governance gets used in many different ways, and as a result have many different meanings. But when you really drill down to how is it applied to the internet and what is internet governance, just get a better understanding of what that actually means and what's happening when internet governance is taking place. As such, what's working? What's not working? How can we do it better? And I think as we heard on the panel this morning, which was focused much more domestically, what are some of the key challenges? But those challenges are arising in different ways all over the world, different countries with different norms, as Bertrand mentioned. So we'll take a look at what are some of the key threats and some of the key challenges, and what are we going to be doing about them. So I just wanted to pass it over to Bill to kick us off. He's seen the internet and internet governance from many different points of view. Maybe just give us a sense of where internet governance is going and what it means to you.
Well, good. Thank you, Byron, and thank you to CIRA and everyone here for making this forum happen today. This is a really great opportunity, and I'm pleased to be taking part. I've had the opportunity to work in government in multilateral institutions for quite a few years. Then I flipped over to the other side and worked with the Internet Society, which was formed by the inventors of the Internet, basically originally to provide a home for the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is the techies who develop standards that make the Internet run, but increasingly as an educational institution and an active force in presenting the views of Internet users in other forums. So it's been a good opportunity to learn, first off, how governments think they run the world, and secondly, how the rest of the world thinks they don't. I'd like to ask to have a slide thrown up here that I worked on at the Internet Society called the Internet Ecosystem. And we pulled this together just to kind of illustrate what the complexity of the Internet governance ecosystem looks like. When it comes up, you'll see that it's just a huge web of interconnected organizations working on different aspects of Internet governance. And that has been tremendously effective. It has been the multi-stakeholder model that we've been talking about off and on here. And you will never get a sense of this from looking at the screen, so I'd urge you to look at the Internet Society website if you want to see it in detail, and there's a paper that goes with it that describes it in some detail. But there really is a tremendous tension between top-down governance models and bottom-up governance models, and Bertrand's referred to this already. We're going to see this coming to a bit of a head in 2012 with a number of processes going on, some of them governmental. The International Telecommunication Union, which is a UN body that has provided standards and regulated the radio frequency spectrum for a very long time, are having a conference in December this year. One of the topics that will be up for discussion and possibly incorporation into a treaty is some intergovernmental controls over things like spam, cybersecurity. That process is being done at a government-only level with no input from the civil society, from the non-government technical community, really. And that's a great example of the top-down model, and that's a very challenging model to work in. On the other hand, you have the Internet Governance Forum, which is really making an impact on the United Nations system, bringing in kind of a bottom-up approach, and that is continuing to develop. So I think I'll stop there just saying that, you know, we work in a tremendously complicated ecosystem here. There are lots of challenges on Internet governance. It's not something where you can say the jury is in on how Internet governance is going to work, and I feel privileged to be working at that coalface. So I'll stop there and let's chat.
Well, maybe I could ask you a follow-up question on that. Having worked inside the Canadian government in and around these issues, can you give us your sense, now that you're outside of it? How is it working in the Canadian context, in the Canadian landscape? How does internet policy get created within Canada, both from a domestic perspective, but also maybe we could add the flavor of vis-a-vis the international ecosystem?
You always start with the easy questions, don't you? Happily, I can say I haven't worked in the Canadian government for a little over 5 years now, so I'm probably not completely up to date. So with that rider, I would just say that when I was working on internet policy, and particularly international internet policy, we tried to reach out to all the interested parts of the Canadian population. the internet governance debate really started with the World Summit on the Information Society that ran from, I guess, 2002 through 2005, if you count the preparatory process. And Canada was the very first country to have civil society representatives on the official government delegation. And we ran a couple of Canadian internet forums in preparation for that, where we brought together representatives from civil society, from business, from the technical community, and a range of provincial and federal governments to help us form our position. So that's been really an underlying concept that I think, without speaking for the government, there's a really solid recognition that the government doesn't know everything, can't do good policy without input from the rest of the population. And there have been various mechanisms and continue to be mechanisms to provide input. On the other hand, forums like this are really important to help people talk about the issues among themselves, and that input goes into the federal government. You've seen Martha Morgan, and I know there's a number of other government officials here. So that informal kind of input goes on as well. At the national level, you know, there are very formal consultation processes as well. Does that help?
I think so, because one of the questions I get all the time is, how does it really work? So I think it's very interesting for people to hear it from the policy-making engine or the boiler room. Internationally, there's, you know, a feedback loop from the domestic environment heading, let's say, towards the international or global environments like the IGF itself. Bertrand, you're very familiar with that space. How does the domestic input get translated up into the global environment? And what's your sense of how that actually works in terms of helping define some of that global internet policy?
That's an interesting challenge, because there are different types of processes. On the one hand, you have relatively traditional international processes in the UN system, basically, or in international organizations that have their own modus operandi. It can be the OECD, it can be APEC, it can be a multitude of international organizations designing guidelines, designing many frameworks. And on the other side, somehow, there is those two laboratories related to policy that are the Internet Governance Forum and ICANN. Both have a completely different function. And the Internet Governance Forum, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is just a gathering of people, a little bit like here, but during a full week every year, for discussing those issues. And one of the main benefits of these processes is just that the different categories of actors are just on an equal footing. They just listen to what the others are saying. And I often make the comparison that it is a little bit like, you know, the story of the 5 blind men and the elephant, where basically you only have a full picture of something if you have people who represent the technical, the economic, the social, the political, and even the legal, and so on. And that's what the IGF produces, and many of those replicating forums are actually providing the space for dialogue. I'm a little bit wary because in many cases when we say a space for dialogue, you immediately get the criticism is, okay, it's fine to dialogue, but what comes out of it? I think progressively, it's not ripe yet, but progressively we're going to move from dialogue to deliberation, which is a little bit more oriented towards defining common interests, common goals, then potentially common methods. It's an evolving process. But it's already an amazing step forward that through the IGF, governments in particular have discovered how beneficial it is for them to have this general picture and also to understand what the others are doing. I mean, other governments. Because in that environment, you actually have a kind of discussion that is much more fluid and open than what you have in traditional negotiation processes, where every word is guarded because you know there will be a negotiation about a text afterwards. And so the moment you say something, you know it's going to bite you back a little bit later if you spoke too quickly. In the IGF, it's easier, the discussion being that it doesn't produce yet formal drafts or regimes, and probably it's good that way. In ICANN, it's a little bit different because ICANN is a relatively complex structure. We could spend a good part of the day explaining how it's organized, but one of the characteristics is that the governments are represented. I mean, Bill has been the representative of Canada in the GAC for a period. I was the French representative as well, in the so-called Governmental Advisory Committee. And without getting into details, one of the interesting things is that on the one hand, even if there's a label advisory, when governments are in line regarding something that raises concern or is causing a problem, it is clear that it has an impact on ICANN and on the ICANN board in particular, which is good. On the other hand, there is a very interesting feedback mechanism because at the national level, the fact that you are going to a meeting of ICANN or the IGF gives some element of justification for telling all the different ministries or agencies that are concerned, why don't we get together to prepare what we're going to say or discuss? And it's not like a negotiation where you have to draft a position and get to a consensus before you go, but it is a way for you to understand what are the different perspectives. And in every country, the law enforcement agency do not have the same perspective as the privacy commissioner. And that's good. That's how it should work.
So you talked about the IGF and ICANN, and of course we have the benefit of being quite familiar with it. But just to step back a second for the audience, ICANN is run as a multi-stakeholder environment, sort of a bottom-up consensus environment. So discussions around policy or the technology or legal privacy or whatever come in a bottom-up kind of environment and then get fed up to the various decision-making groups. So it's a very consensual type of environment vis-a-vis a more traditional treaty-based UN type environment like the IGF. And that's where you tend to get potentially a little bit of friction between these two bodies that come together to deal with many of the same topics around internet governance. And I'm wondering, Bill, that's constantly been a talking point for many people, how these bodies work together, the potential tension between how those two models come together. You've watched it evolve over time. How are we doing now?
I think we're doing not too badly. One of the reasons for the tension is that the internet organizations, if I can put it that way, come out of a tradition that's essentially expert-based. You know, anybody can take part in the discussions, but you better know what you're talking about or you get dumped fairly rapidly. And the dumping process can be brutal. So there you've got a tradition of people largely coming out of the engineering community where, you know, you go in with your expertise, you meet other people with expertise and different perspectives, and you hammer out a solution to a problem. On the government side, you work very carefully to come up with a position that takes into account not so much the technical considerations, more the political considerations. When you talk about internet, you might actually be talking about trade, but you phrase it in words that sound like they're the internet, so you're not necessarily talking about the topic. And you hammer out a final result in a negotiation where nobody really loses everything. And it's a very different culture in the two arenas. So things that have been going on since the World Summit in 2003 have, in my view, really been around how do those two kinds of cultures speak to one another. I think we're gradually learning, and from my perspective, I think we're seeing softening on the government side, respect for the fact that this is really looking for a solution in a very creative way. On the other side, I can tell you absolutely in 2002, 2003, my friends in the IETF side, the engineering task force, did not believe that governments could hurt them. You know, we're back to the governments of the world we've left. We're now in the internet, you have no more authority over us. And it's become very clear that actually that's not working out so well.
Yeah,
so
there are others who might have something to say about that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where we are now, is learning to talk to one another. And I think, Bertrand, you alluded to that in a number of your remarks.
So Bertrand, what's working well? What has improved since '03 and is working well? And where's the key friction point that we need to look at going forward?
I would like to piggyback on your previous question to answer this one. One of the challenges is enforcement. What I think everybody is realizing today is that it's all well and nice to elaborate whatever principles, law, rules, or whatever that you may think are perfect. If you cannot implement them, they're void. And so I think what is working well, ironically, is that there is a level of realization at the moment that the model is reaching its limits. And what is working well is that there is a better spirit of cooperation, and my hope, I'm always a very optimistic and voluntary person in that respect, but my hope is that actually the extremists on each side are going to become in the minority. I'm not sure it will happen, but I can see that happening because, let's be frank, there are extremists everywhere. There are extremists on the governmental side that want to have exclusively intergovernmental discussions on anything that has to do with the internet, period. Because it's a matter of national sovereignty, blah, blah. On the other hand, you have some business extremists that say, no government, this is all self-regulation, and there should be nobody imposing anything. We should be allowed to get all the data we want and treat it the way we want and examine the terms of service that we want. You even have extremists in the techies that say basically you don't touch any principle that was the basis that made it work correctly, even if it has bad consequences. So without getting into a long debate, what I find fascinating is that through the IGF, and even in international other processes, even in the G8, even in the OECD, even in the Council of Europe, you have now discussions that are emerging where there is a recognition that if people don't get around the table to address the issue together, there's no way to solve it. And the panel before was a perfect illustration of that. I was very impressed, and I appreciated the fact that people had very strong opinion, that they were able to express them in front of the other parties, and that everybody got better information out of it without relinquishing their own position. And I sensed a clear desire to move beyond the zero-sum game that we're all trapped into. Because at the moment, the danger is that if every single category of actor tries to solve the problems that we're facing on its own, the end result for everybody will be worse than what we can accomplish together. And I think we are getting to the transition point, or the inflection point, where people are beginning to realize this. It may not work, but I agree with what was said before. This year is a very important year, because in the first month, we have demonstrated that national efforts with the SOPA-PIPA hit a wall, that the multilateral effort purely in the ACTA thing hits a wall when it gets to the citizens. And now the question is, what are the processes? And fundamentally, it's about democracy in the digital age. It's not only governance of the internet or on the internet, it's governance also in the digital age or at the age of the internet.
That's a pretty, that's a pretty big picture view. Bill, what do you see as the key stumbling blocks for governance of the internet right now, maybe building upon what Bertrand was mentioning?
I think we're really at an inflection point where governments have found a focus for their desire to have more influence over the internet through the International Telecommunication Union. The Arab League, for example, are coming in with some quite strong demands. The Russian Federation is coming in with some very, very strong positions on cybersecurity. The Chinese are there with, again, a very strong control view, and they are going to be discussing these different proposals in an environment where businesses and civil society don't have any input. which is very convenient for them and not particularly good for the rest of us, in my view. So I think we're seeing the command and control model making another very significant drive this year. I think we've got to find ways as non-government actors to influence our own governments. So in Canada, there's a preparatory process. I think it's important, and I know CIRA is involved in that. It's important to be making the point that there are things that need to be protected there. The same is true in a number of other countries. And I'm going to take the opportunity of having the mic to ask you what your experience is like as the CEO of CIRA, very much concerned with the Canadian internet user and Canadian perspectives. How do you find it dealing with your colleagues at the national level and the international level to bring those perspectives forward?
Aren't I supposed to be asking questions?
Nice try, Byron.
Yeah. I like the way you turned that around. An experienced hand here. Well, certainly I've found the dynamic of the ICANN-based environment a very positive and constructive one. But you know, I'm really interested in some of the comments that Bertrand's making around jurisdictional issues and territorial issues and scalability. You know, that's one thing in the tech world where you use a word like that, and a lot of the technical folks can really, it resonates and they appreciate it. And in a sense, it's almost like we're living that moment in history right now where have we reached the limit of the, let's call it a pure multi-stakeholder model, that we have to recognize, especially folks who've been around it a while, that are we at the limits of that, and how do we deal with the jurisdictional issues that seem to be continuing to creep in and challenge a multi-stakeholder model? Because there's many governments that have legitimate concerns. How do you address that in a multi-stakeholder model without it seeming like the governments are overwhelming the multi-stakeholder model? And I have to admit, I've watched with amazement, you know, what happened with SOPA, that an internet protest could get Congress in the U.S. to roll over and fold like a cheap suit within a matter of weeks, right? You have ACTA. I mean, this is a fairly esoteric concept, and they're basically rioting in the streets in Poland, over 10,000 people in the last March, the biggest crowds seen since the end of communism in Poland. Around ACTA, C30. I mean, I have to admit, when I saw that coming on the heels of SOPA, I thought, this isn't going to go over well, and clearly C30 didn't. And our own government has, well, I won't use the same metaphor, but taken a step back to reflect on it. So all of these elements are happening at one time, and to me, Bertrand's comment keeps resonating. Have we reached some sort of limit? And that doesn't have to be a bad thing. The multi-stakeholder model is an excellent model. How do we adapt to the scale issue at this point and recognize legitimate concerns of governments while ensuring, in a sense, we don't kill the golden goose, which the internet has been for many societies, from an innovation front of jobs, wealth creation, democracy perspective. And how do we find that balance? And to go back around to your question, I've found the colleagues that I work with in the space very passionate, very concerned, and easy to work with. I don't agree with them all the time, but I think it's the right kind of environment for the global internet to be operated in. I know Christopher is looking at me, so it must mean we're on time to start asking some questions.
Right, and let's just bring everyone here into the same conversation. So with that, we open the floor again to your questions or comments for our panelists to join this conversation. Toujours en français, vous êtes le bienvenu, and if we have any webcast questions, I'll be taking them off the screen at the front. So the mic runners are available, and what are your questions for our panelists?
And I would absolutely encourage people to jump in here, because it's not often that we have the opportunity to talk to folks who are truly at the heart of how the internet is operated and governed.
Right. And your comments and views as well as your questions. Yes, please.
Hi, Perry Eisenschmidt. For me, it seems like the issue in terms of governing the internet is one of legitimacy. So you speak about governments who earn their legitimacy through the different models, whether it's democracy or the other models around the world. How do you, in an attempt to centrally and globally govern the internet, earn legitimacy for your decisions and actions?
That's a great question. Bertrand, could I ask you to kick that off?
It is a fundamental question, and legitimacy is always about due process. It's about having the guarantee that the viewpoints of people are faithfully taken into account. One of the challenges that we're facing globally speaking is that the representative democracy model is of course a wonderful system, but once you've voted, you basically are waiting until the next election to have a real impact on how things are going to emerge. And furthermore, the system has a sort of uniform responsibility for all issues. By definition, a parliament has the responsibility for all issues at the national level. What I see emerging, and ICANN is a tiny little experiment in that respect, is something that goes much more horizontal on an issue-based approach. And the goal is to identify on a topic-by-topic basis what the stakeholder network is and the appropriate mechanisms to handle the issues that are at stake. And so for the domain name system, the model may be ICANN, with certain types of stakeholders represented. For another type of issue, on privacy or on something else, or on defining the terms of service or the rules for terms of service of social media platforms, it may be a different balance. Maybe one day we will have a Facebook governance forum to help define the terms of service of Facebook. Who knows? And maybe governments will take part in this definition of the Facebook terms of service. So the question of legitimacy is fundamentally going back to the people. And one key element is we're talking about online, we're talking about cyberspace and cyberspaces. I believe we're talking about communities. And I believe in the bottom line, we're talking about self-determination of online communities to define their own rules in their private or semi-private spaces. And so it's a sort of Russian doll system whereby the fundamental element is the personal sovereignty and the aggregation of groups. When groups define their own rules for a small subset, it can be for, I don't know, on Tumblr, you post certain things that you don't post on others. And on Twitter, you can post certain things that you cannot post somewhere else. Those platforms are also communities. And we were talking, somebody was mentioning the notion that Facebook, and it's one example, there are many others, when you have 800 million people, how do you set the rules for those 800 million people on the platform? Is it really by having an intergovernmental discussion at the UN level? I mean, it makes no sense. So legitimacy is process and founded on personal sovereignty and the aggregation of personal sovereignties.
And I might
Pure
just...
personal, sorry, a caveat, pure personal comment, of course, not a position of the ICANN board in general.
Right. He's expressing his personal sovereignty there. And I might just jump in. I think Bertrand gave an excellent overview of the concept of how it works. Within the ICANN world, I work in the country code space, which is one of the communities that makes up the ICANN ecosystem. And certainly there, just to bring it down to the working level too, in a sense, it's really a crowdsourced environment. Every country has a country code. Everybody can come to that forum and that space to discuss and deal with issues relative to the country code. You come to that, you bring expertise, you bring input and commitment and work, and you are validated in a sense by your peer group for that expertise, work, input, etc. And that confers legitimacy on the positions getting put forward because they're vetted through a group of experts in that space, and then that's, let's say, put up and forward through the ICANN process. And in a sense, you asked about legitimacy. That I think, is a ground level view of it too. And it's really almost like a crowdsourced vetting process of experts in your space, and then that position, once vetted, moves through the ICANN process. Bill?
Yeah, I'd just say the traditional proof of legitimacy in the internet community is that it works. You know, the internet keeps developing, new things come along, solutions are found, it keeps working. The problem is, recently, it hasn't all been working. We've been hearing new voices coming in, some of them from government, some from this really hugely expanded user base, saying, well, it's not working for me so well. So the challenge for us really is to extend legitimacy based on effectiveness to address the concerns of these new voices.
We have an online question from Kevin. What can Canada do to ensure that the Americans follow the ICANN process and don't circumvent it with unilateral domain seizures like Hoja Directa? Bertrand, did you want to try that one?
Well, I don't know, just a show of hands, who is familiar with the Hoja Directa case in Spain? Okay, that's what I thought. So it may deserve just a very tiny explanation. Yeah. There was a website called Hoja Directa in Spain, managed by a European citizen, that through a Spanish court was deemed legal in Spain and was actually making links to, indeed, probably potentially infringing copyright material. But the fact is that it was a site that was managed by a European citizen and deemed legal in Spain. Because the domain name hojadirecta.com was bought through a registrar based in the US, this was sufficient to establish the jurisdiction of the US administration through the arm of the Homeland Security called ICE that seized the domain. This is exactly what I was alluding to when I mentioned in my presentation, this notion of the fractalization of sovereignty. And I want to be very clear when I mention this. This is not directly related to an ICANN activity. It's very important to mention that. This is about application of national law. The point I want to make here is that we cannot ask the US administration, which has the benefit of having a lot of operators based on American soil, not to overextend their sovereignty in that way if there is no process to handle the problems that those administrations are worried about. Legitimately or not, that's not the point. If you have a government that is legitimately concerned about a certain number of things, and it has the capacity to interact through its national law, if you don't want this government to extend its sovereignty somewhere else, you need to be open to discussing what are the international cooperation modalities that will allow a fair balance and the respect of the different elements. I think when I was talking about the inflection points, what is happening at the moment is that governments are now themselves understanding that more and more of their own citizens are being subject to the legislation of another country. And it's not only because of the US. In Norway, if you go to the privacy commissioner in Norway about a problem you have with Facebook, it says, the answer is, I'm not competent, you should go to the privacy commissioner in Ireland because Facebook is serving the European Union from Ireland. So if you're Norwegian, you are not going to your privacy commissioner in Norway, you're going to Ireland. So this overlap is this fractalization that I'm talking about. So it's not a problem for ICANN, it's a problem more generally for the international community to handle this question of jurisdiction. This is why there's a program of the International Diplomatic Academy that deals with that.
And I think it's, you know, it's an issue that people are becoming more and more aware of. You know, there's a notion that the internet is a cloud, it's virtual, it's somewhere in space, right? And the fact is, it's resident on servers, in data centers, sitting on somebody's jurisdiction. And that jurisdiction is probably what's going to rule the day. And when you look at just a domain name, the space that CIRA specifically in, I mean, you have the registry, which is what we do. We're resident here. You have the registrars whom that domain name is sold through, and they are in a number of jurisdictions, not just Canada, potentially. So you know, there's many jurisdictions that just your single domain name may flow, and people definitely need to be aware of that, let alone where your website resides, in some data center somewhere. And if your only issue is low-cost provider, you might want to think about, well, there may be other issues to consider. And I guess that's going to be part of the work that you're doing. And I think it's going to be, you know, it's a fascinating and complex subject that we as digital citizens have to be very clear about. Yes, it's digital and virtual, but it sits somewhere.
If I may add just one point in that regard. I was mentioning the separation between the transport layer and the application layer, which is really one of the core elements of the architecture of the internet, because theoretically the transport layer, the infrastructure, is supposed to be completely agnostic regarding what goes through. What's happening at the moment is that there is a sort of discovery by the legal environment that the frontier of the infrastructure layer, which is the intermediaries, it can be the registries, the registrars, also the platform managers and so on, are actually an amazing nexus of potential pressure for solving some content-related issues. And so it is just like the discovery of a wonderful switchboard, an enormous switchboard with a lot of flips here and there, and it looks very natural to say, oh, well, wonderful, there's this technical layer. We have a content problem, let's leverage the technical layer. The problem is, this is tinkering with the separation. And the fundamental question, which is a policy question, is how far can we tinker with the separation to solve very valid problems without harming the principles that have allowed the internet to function correctly. So I was talking about fundamentalists. Techies would say there's absolutely no way the infrastructure should help solve content-related issues are going too far. Because just like Lawrence Lessig said, code is law, you can imagine the reverse, like law embedded in code. And when some of us are talking about privacy by design, that's what we're doing. So there's no sacred cow about the separation of the layers. The question is, to what extent can we gain a benefit without harming the other part?
And I think that's something I'd like to pick up on. And I think we're possibly seeing it within legislatures around the world. And that's the notion that they're used to legislating on an industry or on an issue, which tends to be vertical. And yet the internet is an enabling technology which is horizontal, spanning every industry and almost every social interaction. And you really have no idea when you try to pull a legislative lever over here around copyright or imminent child endangerment online. You're pulling that legislative lever, yet you have no idea what the impact was over here from a technology, an enabling technology point of view. And that's why I think, you know, if you go back to C30, there's all kinds of unintended consequences. And I think that's a perfect example right now of where governments, legitimate governments, are in a bind trying to find the right method to have some sense of control or input on the internet without damaging all the good that the internet brings us.
And with that, we'll take one question, but we're just enough to squeak it in.
Okay, thank you. My name's John Sobel from YarYarMedia.com. I'm interested in the relationship between governance and culture, and I guess in the limits of diplomacy in the context of the internet. It seems to me that your efforts, admirable as they are to balance those very different agendas and needs, are about essentially discussing what should be done so that what can be done is done for the best. Whereas it seems to me that the way that most of us actually, or collectively we seem to be operating in the digital age, is that what can be done determines what should be done. And I think the Hoja Directa case is an example of this, as I would cite, for example, at the other end of the spectrum, the Bradley Manning case and WikiLeaks. In both cases, faced with a moral, social, legal, technological problem. The result was to take advantage of what the technology enabled to achieve a particular goal. And so my question is, if indeed that is a paradigm that is relevant, and if the world is evolving based on what the internet enables us to do and to become, do you see that there's a risk that your actions are to some extent going to be overwhelmed by the tide of what I would call a digital culture that may transcend some of the governmental structures that you're working hard to make work? Is that an issue that you see as being relevant, and how might you look ahead to trying to employ diplomacy to address that broader change for the better? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's a nice light question to finish off on.
Sorry about that.
Before lunch. I might ask Bill, since you have a real Canadian context and policy-making context and are now very much in the global world, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a very real danger, and honestly, the question of what the end result will be is very much open. That's why processes like the Internet Governance Forum, like what we do in ICANN in that limited space, what we do with our governments domestically to make sure that they understand what the risks are and what people need to be able to do as a way of informing the domestic policy making. All those things are very, very important. It really is the question of the day, the question of the year, and I suspect it's going to go on long before that. Hate to waffle, but I just don't have a crystal ball that's really helping me with this.
I mean, I think there's a very, there's very elemental sentiment in there. Just because we can do it doesn't mean we should, and that's part of the dialogue we're having right now. Technology has afforded us so much opportunity, but we need to be very, very careful about how we use it, and those are some of the discussions that go on at the IGF that this is a feeder into, and I think you're absolutely right. Just because we can doesn't mean we should, and we need to be very clear and think through the implications of bad legislation or fundamentalism on any side of these internet questions.
Okay, so thank you for your comments and questions, and I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.